Welcome to the overview of school obligations to English learners. If you have any questions about the following information, I hope that you'll join me on the 16th at 9:30 a.m. for our unconference session, where I'd be happy to try to answer any of the questions you might have about this content. The following items will be covered in this presentation. So let's begin with a definition of an English learner. This is the U.S. Department's definition. Basically, an English learner is a student aged 3 through 21 enrolled in a preschool through 12th grade school who may have been born in the U.S. or out of the U.S. and whose linguistic exposure and experiences have led to the student having difficulty in speaking, reading, writing, or understanding the English language, wherein they need extra supports and scaffolds to be successful in the classroom and beyond. There are several Supreme Court case decisions and laws that inform schools of the steps that need to be followed to ensure a meaningful educational experience for our English learners. The Lau v. Nichols case ruled that schools need to ensure they are providing a meaningful educational experience where the English learners receive language development assistance, but also have access to learning the appropriate grade level content. Castaneda v. Pickard case requires that schools develop a sound approach to the education of their EL students, that they have reasonable implementation of that approach, and that they have outcomes reflecting that the approach is working. And Plyler v. Doe ruled that public schools may not deny admission to a student based on they or their parents' undocumented status. They may not treat a student disparately to determine residency. They may not require students or parents to disclose their immigration status, nor may they must not require social security numbers from the students. So in summary, schools must enroll all school-aged youth regardless of immigration status. They must provide access to all curricula through meaningful scaffolds and linguistic supports with programming that is evidence-based. Additionally, schools must continue to evaluate the effectiveness of the program to ensure that students are making gains in English language development and achieving academic success. All of the aforementioned cases were ruled based on the Civil Rights Act and the Equal Educational Opportunity Act. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 stated that Title VI is in violation if students are excluded from effective participation in school because of the language barrier, national origin minority students are misassigned to special education classes, programs for students whose English is less than proficient operate as dead-end tracks, and if EL parents do not receive school information in a language they can understand. So all school districts to which Title VI of Civil Rights Act of 1964 applies are required by federal law to translate and interpret all documents and communications with parents who are not fluent in English into a language they can understand. The Equal Education Opportunity Act of 1974 stated that no state shall deny equal educational opportunity to an individual on account of his or her race, color, sex, or national origin by the failure of an educational agency to take appropriate action to overcome language barriers that impede equal participation by its students in its instructional programs. So further guidance for schools may be found in the Dear Colleague letter and the English Learner Toolkit, which is on the USDE site linked in this slide, and also in the end in the reference. Here we have ESSA's 10 obligations for English learners. These obligations were all informed by the aforementioned laws and Supreme Court decisions that have provided protections for our culturally and linguistically diverse students and their families. These legal obligations are required by all districts who accept any federal funding. and these requirements must be paid for with general education funds. So, for example, districts must use general education funds to staff their EL program. Also, districts must provide translations and/or interpretations for all communications to the families with their general ed funds, not Title III funds. This is important background knowledge for you to have as we take a closer look into the 10 obligations in the subsequent slides. So let's begin with the identification. In order to identify a student as an English learner, or EL, as you may hear me refer them to, language usage surveys must go home to every new child newly enrolling in the school. This is done at initial enrollment and does not need to be given to the child again, even if the child attends the school more than 1 year. So every rising kindergarten, for example, must complete the language usage survey. Or any child entering your school district after kindergarten for the first time, they must complete the language usage survey. If a language other than English is on the language usage survey, the child must be given the Ohio English Language Proficiency Screener, otherwise known as the OELPS. If a student is limited in listening, speaking, reading, and/or writing on this screener, then the child is deemed as an English learner. Schools must enter all the information into EMIS, the EL status, home language, native language, and then if the student is identified as an English learner, the school then needs to determine appropriate services for the student. They then send a parent notification home that states the test results, the test that was administered, services provided, and this all needs to happen within the first 30 days of school. And if the child enrolls after the first day of school, then it needs to happen within 2 weeks. If the student is identified as an English learner, the student will have to participate in the state's annual English Language Proficiency Assessment, otherwise known as the OELPA. In addition to taking the annual OELPA assessment, EL students must take all or any required state assessments. They can get the English learner accommodations on those assessments. And the schools must also then inform the teachers who will be working with the students. So the teachers need to know what those initial screener results are or the annual OELPA results are in the domains of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. They need to have this so they can provide the appropriate scaffolds based on language proficiency. And then we must continuously monitor student progress and program effectiveness. This is the required language usage survey. All 7 questions must be asked verbatim, whether children enroll electronically or with paper. However you do enrollment in your school, these are the 7 questions that must be asked. Districts can choose additional questions to add to these 7, and they have examples of what some of these additional questions might look like in the appendix in the language usage survey that's on ODE's website. So number 1, the first question here, it tells you how you need to be communicating with the parent. A list of parents who need interpreters should be in the office of every building in case of an emergency. But we need to also keep in mind that some students may have exited EL status, but their parents still need interpreters. So we need to keep that list at the front office, and teachers need to be informed of this also for any communications that they may send home, so they can get it in a language that the parents can understand. Numbers 2 through 4 on this tell us the native language and home language, which gets reported in EMIS. And then number 5 through 7 gives us information about the previous schooling and whether or not we mark them as immigrant in EMIS. And for school For school EMIS purposes, the definition of immigrant is a child who is born outside of the U.S. or its territories and have been in U.S. schools 3 years or less. And this does not include preschool. So they may have attended preschool for 2 years, but year one for EMIS purposes starts in kindergarten. Once a student is flagged on the language usage survey as needing a screener, the OALPS is administered by a school staff member. In order to administer the screener, a student needs an SSID number, so it is imperative that the SSID numbers are assigned immediately to the students who are flagged so that schools can administer the screener in an appropriate time manner and also to make appropriate placement decisions. And once administered, the schools will have access to the child's scores within a couple hours, sometimes even less than that. And students will be given a score of 1 through 5 in the domains of reading, writing, listening, and speaking. If the student tests as not proficient in any one of those domains, the student is deemed as an English learner and must be coded accordingly into EMIS. The following information gets coded, so we have to put in LEP status, Limited English Proficient. We're looking at changing that language, but right now that's the language that's used in EMIS. And they get these codes, and these codes are critical to have accurate for accountability purposes. So if a student is within 180 days, so within 1 year, not one school academic year, but within that first 180 days in U.S. schools, they get a code of L. So that changes to S when they move into their second year of U.S. schools. Important to note here is that if a student comes in, say in January, they're an L until the following January. So we need to make note of that and when to make those changes into EMIS. And it's important that we code an L and an S appropriately because that informs the Department of Education that those kids' state test scores will not count for accountability. They still take the test, but their scores do not count for accountability purposes. So that's why it's extremely important that we get those codes accurate. After their second year in U.S. schools, they are marked as a Y. And then this M score is if they get any combinations of 4s and 5s on the OALPA, but maybe one score is a 3. And this is linked to some of our old assessment and requirements, and they're looking at changing the meaning of the M, but for now, this is as it stands. And then an N is if they are not limited English proficient. The immigration status, once again, is a student born outside of the U.S. Or U.S. territory, and they've been in U.S. schools 3 years or less. This is why it's extremely important to get that date of entry to U.S. schools, especially if a child transfers from another school or a state. We need to have that information. And there's money attached to this, as well as money attached to these LEP status codes as well. So the immigrant status, we get extra funds for students marked as immigrant. If you have like a 5% increase over 2-year time, then you get those funds and those go directly to the school. We also need to enter their native language and home language. And while this seems redundant, often it is 2 different languages. So for example, we have students who speak Quiche. That was their first language they learned, but now they're using Spanish in the home. So this is important for us to distinguish also. So if your district uses Dazzle as a reporting system, this EMIS information is entered into the FD Attributes tab. If your school district uses eSchool, this information is on the student attribute program page. But with eSchool, you also need to make sure that you check the ESL, English as a Second Language box, on the personal screen also. And this is important for administering the OELPA through TIDE and getting them in TIDE, okay? So now that we've discussed the identification and assessment of English learners, let's move on to providing a meaningful education for our English learners. So these highlighted areas are the areas we're going to cover in this next session. And I'd like to begin with grade placement. It is never appropriate to place an English learner student in a grade lower than their chronological age due to linguistic difference. It is never appropriate to place an English learner student in a grade lower than their chronological age due to linguistic difference. This is important because we see this happen sometimes. We have to put them in the appropriate grade level. However, if a student has interrupted formal education where they have gaps missing in their education, then we might consider it, because that's not on the linguistic difference. That's because of gaps in their education. But if we're making this grade placement decision because of interrupted formal education, a team needs to get together to help determine the best placement. And the placement should always be in a grade as close to their chronological age as possible. But we need to make sure that the EL coordinator or a TESOL teacher or somebody knowledgeable about English learners in your district is a part of that team making that decision. And if you're not sure, you can always contact me as the consortium consultant, and I'd be glad to help as well. Students should not be placed in special education settings just because of a linguistic difference either, unless that student is identified as having a disability. Nor should students be segregated from their native English-speaking peers. So in the state of Ohio, we have 10 English language proficiency standards that are the same for grades K through 12. These are the same standards for all the grade levels. And as you can see, they are very broadly worded so that they are appropriate in any grade level subject matter across the curriculum. If you click on this link or at the end of this presentation on that reference page, it'll take you to Ohio's standards that are divided by grade level, and they'll show you what each standard might look like in Ohio's 5 proficiency levels by grade level. So let's take a look at what that might look like. This is an example of grades 4 through 5 standards number 1 and 2. Remember, there's 10 standards, so these are the first 2. The standards are stated in the far left column. The following 5 columns are what is expected of those standards by the end of each of those proficiency levels 1 through 5. I often refer to this as the cheat sheet that content teachers can use to provide the appropriate scaffolds towards achieving the standard. So for example, if a student is a level 1 listener and reader, the teacher who is expecting students to construct meaning from an oral presentation or grade-appropriate text, as in that first standard, can look at level 1 and 2 columns to determine scaffolds so the students can meet the goals as stated in those columns. It's important to remember that these portray what students can do at the end of each level. So we'll want to bridge the students from level 1 to 2 if we don't know their scale score. So we want to look at both of those standards or columns in 1 and 2 to see what we can do to meet their needs so that they can achieve that standard. In this version of the standard, it shows the correlation with Ohio's ELA science and math standards so that the content teachers can correlate the standards. And this was done, these standards were created with a consortium of districts, and so they looked at those national standards, and there were no social studies national standards or there aren't currently. So that's the only reason. Social studies subjects are not on here. However, social studies teachers should still be using this rubric with these standards. When all teachers working with English learners use these standards, we will see student growth in language and academics. It also ensures that schools are meeting the ESSA obligations of providing language assistance to EL students in the content areas and providing meaningful access to the curriculum. And then the OELPA assesses students on these standards, and the students must show growth every year. So we need to get everybody to be using these standards. School districts must also ensure that they have teachers with the qualifications necessary for providing language development services. In other words, we need to have a TESOL endorsed teacher providing language development. So this link here, this shows you Ohio's requirements for the qualifications of teachers of the English Language Development Program. When providing multi-tiered systems of support, it is important to note that students of all levels of English proficiency, basic, intermediate, and advanced, levels 1 through 5, require culturally and linguistically responsive teaching and instruction in each of the tiers of support. In other words, all teachers need to support the students in language and academics in culturally responsive ways, no matter what tier of support they are receiving in a given setting. This holds true even for students whose parents opted out of the English Language Development Program. We still provide them with the linguistic and academic supports in culturally responsive ways in whatever tier of academic supports they receive. They wouldn't attend the instruction time with the TESOL instructor, but we still must provide scaffolds as necessary so they meet academic success. They must also still take the OELPA assessment. So as a reminder, all students who are screened as English learners must take the OELPA. The only way to exit EL status is by scoring an overall proficient on this assessment. And EL students also take all grade level required assessments, but they are permitted different accommodations. We must never retain a student based on their language difference. We must never retain a student based on their language difference. This slide provides guidance for districts who may be questioning retention for an English learner. The decision should be a team decision again, and there should always be a TESOL person on that team. A TESOL instructor, EL coordinator, or Title III consultant needs to be involved in this decision. It gets tricky. And if you do determine to retain a student, and this is irregardless of third grade guarantee, if you do, which ELs can be exempt if they've been in the program 3 years or less. If you do determine retention is best for the student, then you need to have documentation that it is not because of a language difference. And I often hear, especially at the lower grades, that, well, they haven't met the grade level standard. I'm going to refer you back to the ELP standards and take a look at those. Did they not meet the standards at that proficiency level? Did they not meet the standards because of their language? So that gets tricky, and that's why you should have an EL person on your team to help with those decisions. Now let's move on to monitoring and exiting of English learners. Once a student meets the exit criteria, which is a combination of 4s and 5s in the 4 domains of listening, speaking, reading, and writing on the OELPA, we then change their status in EMIS, and we must monitor them for a minimum of 2 years. It's up to local control what that monitoring looks like, but currently the state is working on providing some further guidance. The English learners will be included in the EL cohort for accountability purposes for 4 years after they exit. And so how do we know a program is effective? These are the 7 ESSA requirements for program evaluation. For number 7, Ohio will also look at EL students' involvement in extracurricular activities, gifted programs, special education programs, career tech programs, honors, CCP, AP, and ELs who meet graduation requirements within 4 or 5 years. If your district is a part of the Stark County ESC Title III Consortium, we have developed a tool for you to use to gather this data. So you can ask your district EL coordinator, or you can contact me for further information about that tool. And finally, we're going to discuss this last ESSA obligation. Schools must provide translations and interpretations for parents in their preferred language. So EL, or I should say the parents who speak another language, remember that's number 1 on that language usage survey. Even if their child has exited EL status, they may still need that interpretive service. So they must be notified of the availability of free and effective language assistant with respect to school programs and activities. So we need to not only provide that interpreter and translation, but we need to tell them that it is at no cost to them. Often they feel like it is, or don't know that it's free, and they pay for interpreters to come with them, and they don't need to do that. Also, we don't want them to bring their interpreters because they have not been trained to interpret accurately. And sometimes if it's a family member, then they may put their own twist to what the educator or school is actually saying. School staff must be made aware of the parents' need for language assistance and given information about how to make sure that that happens. And annually, staff must be notified that the use of family members or friends for language assistance is not acceptable. Never, ever do we allow a sibling or another child to interpret for the family. That is never appropriate. But we also must remind the staff each year that we should not be using one of the family's family members. That can cause all kinds of problems. And then each building in a district must keep an updated centralized list of parents and families who require language assistance and the specifics of the language assistance required. So, in case we have any kind of emergencies, then even if the secretary or administrative assistant is not there that day, they have that list of parents who need communications in another language, whoever's subbing for that person. But we should always keep that at the front of the desk or front of the office building at all times. And every Stark County ESC affiliated district and every Stark County ESC Title III Consortium district is set up with an interpreter service through VocaLink. And if you have any questions about that, contact your EL coordinator in your district about how to access that, or you can contact me as well. But regardless of whether you use VocaLink, your in-house interpreters, or you have somebody else that you use, you should have it written down, the protocol for accessing those interpreters or translation services, so all staff is made aware of the protocol that you've set up. And basically, what I want to remind you is that with our English learners, it can't just be that TESOL teacher's responsibility. It is a shared responsibility to meet the needs of our English learners and their families in our schools. Everyone needs to take ownership. Everyone needs to be on board with moving that child forward and with meeting their needs. And then finally, I have a list here of different resources that I've referenced or that were on slides with the links. And these are all great resources that I hope that you'll delve into. And if you have any questions, please join us on the 16th at 9:30 a.m. for an unconference session. Thank you for your time.